We're going to be in Exodus 5 tonight. Skin, I guess, is drying out in this cold weather. I just can't grip the page. Okay. Hello, Sherry and Robin. We're glad you're here. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so, see if anybody else shows up. Okay, that's a minute and a half, so we'll get going here. We're in Exodus chapter 5, as I say in the handout. It's a little bit of a difficult chapter to subdivide. It's kind of a running narrative from the beginning of the chapter, actually into chapter 6, the first verse of chapter 6. But we will subdivide it kind of so we can deal with it a little bit at a time. And we'll read the first 9 verses to begin. And afterward, Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." Excuse me. "Let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice, to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord. Besides, I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you draw the people away from their work? Get back to your labors." And Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from their labors." So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen, saying, "You are no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the quota of bricks which they were previously making, you shall impose on them. You are not to reduce any of it, because they are lazy, and therefore they cry out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Let the labor be heavier on the men, and let them work at it, so that they will pay no attention to false words." Okay, what do we think about those 9 verses there?
Well, one thing that I just saw this time ahead is, he said, "Look, the people of the land are many now." And I don't know, in my mind, I'm just thinking, they've gone through that period, 40 years before that, where they had been killing the firstborn.
Oh, you mean the genocide that they were trying?
Yeah.
Yes, it evidently was not very effective, whatever the attempts.
Generation of where there was a whole lot of the males that were killed, and if that had gone on for a while and then stopped, there would be, and before they were afraid that there was getting to be too many of them. So I think, his response in a way is like, I'm not putting up with any rebellion to these people because there's too many of them. Kind of like the war a generation or so ago before this Pharaoh. But, I'm going to make sure you're busy so you don't have any time to give any kind of uprising.
Okay, it's an interesting way of looking at it. I have never exactly heard that point, but it would have been 80 years ago, 80 years prior to this, when Moses was born. Moses was 40 when he fled Egypt, was gone for 40 years, and has now returned. During that time, that method, how successful it was, of course, the midwives were trying to help and get around it, frustrated it. Whatever successes it had were minimal and were evidently overwhelmed because, as you said, Pharaoh is still looking out at a mass of humanity out there. And if his predecessor had any success in reducing the population of Israel with the attempted genocide, maybe on the one hand, it wouldn't have been so numerous out there. Any successes he had may have made the work heavier on the people who did survive. But yeah, it's an interesting thought to put that part of the story into the context of this part of the story, which is they're getting ready to go, and there's still a whole bunch of them. So
I just thought it was interesting. He said, and then he was telling, there's a bunch of them.
And I'm working you all hard, so you're producing a lot of work, and it's one of those things. When people in their jobs kind of go above and beyond, they go on the real fringe of what can possibly be done, kind of beyond what is reasonable to expect. It can't become the norm. And for a lot of people, it does, for themselves and maybe for their employers. It's not healthy. It's not the way God intended people to work. It's, Pharaoh is getting used to this excessive amount of labor coming from the Hebrews in building his empire, whatever they're actually building at this time. It's probably not the Great Pyramids, but it is. Egypt was a vast empire with a lot of buildings. They're still finding, and it's a very, they were using this slave labor to build part of the empire up, and you get hooked on it, and it's hard to do without, even for just a short break, even just for a time. So yes. Good points, Ed. Anybody else have any thoughts on these verses?
Well, Pharaoh, he says, who is the Lord that I should obey him? I'm the Pharaoh. I'm the king of Egypt. Who is this guy?
He's a god. Well, I'm a god too. Yeah. Without the attitude that he has, though, it's ultimately a question we all have to ask. Are we going to obey the Lord? Who is this Lord? And am I going to obey him? And
sometimes it's with the attitude.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I mean, Pharaoh is kind of humanity at its worst, in a sense, and maybe on steroids at that. But, he's not so detached from humanity that we can't identify with him to some extent. That we all have our vision and our goal. We can all be demanding of others at times. We all want other people to help us kind of accomplish what we want to accomplish in life. And it's a very stark contrast between, say, Pharaoh and Jesus, who comes and calls people to follow him. And to follow him, they have to put down their fishing nets, leave their tax collecting booth. They have to leave their earthly burdens behind to follow him and to take up their cross. So it's an interesting contrast between how God wants his people to serve him and how pharaohs of the world want people to serve them. And you look at the break, you think about 3 days journey into wilderness, presumably a 3-day journey back. There's 6 days. And then however long the feast lasts, you're looking at a week or more of vacation time, basically. And the know, slaves didn't get vacations back then. If you've ever been on a cruise, you know the people that work cleaning your rooms and cooking and all that stuff. They sign like 6 or 8 month contracts. They work every day of those 6 or 8 months. They don't take a day off unless they're sick. And then their buddies have to cover for them, and then they cover for their buddies when their buddies are sick or whatever. And then they get a month or 2 off or whatever after that at home. Some days are heavier for them than others, I think, but basically they work every day. And that's always bothered me. Not enough to not go on the cruise, I guess, but it is bothersome to know that these people don't get a day, at least one day a week off. And that's why all the cruise ships are registered in different countries, because if they were registered in America, they'd have American labor laws over them. So, and I'm not trying to condemn the cruise companies, but I think we see in this, and you tie everything back to creation. You know, a God that rested. I mean, if God rests, his people should rest. And it kind of pushes against this kind of go, work harder mentality that it's not just America, and maybe America is pretty far away from it, especially far away from the lead on that. There's other countries that really, the day off is just a foreign concept to them, basically. And it reflects, though, I think at its core, a lack of faith in that God will provide. It's all of it is kind of working together. And God has called upon his people to rest. God will provide. It will be there. You will have enough. And when we don't operate and place the priorities in the right way and view it in a godly sense, we're telling God, no, you won't provide. I've got to provide.
Well, he proved it with the manna. If you got too much on the daily one, it ruined, and so you didn't have any left over. And then on the day that they were to be rested, they gathered twice as much, and it was good the next day.
Mm-hmm. The biblical ethic about work and acquisition of wealth and everything is so different than ours. We can't really even begin to comprehend it, I don't think, or we haven't begun to comprehend it. It is, we admire some of the Old Testament characters who were very wealthy, but it should be understood that their wealth came about in the natural, God blessing them with, as they kept Torah, as they kept the law. It wasn't because they went above and beyond. That's never really the portrayal. If they went above and beyond, it was in sacrifice. And it was in obedience. It was not in, I'm going to work harder than the next guy. Everybody worked hard. And in the American, we inherited a lot of this, certainly from Scotland. The Churches of Christ especially are very Scottish, if they want to admit it or not. But the Scots were thrifty. They were thrifty, and they worked hard, and they saved their money. That's how they did it. And I'm not trying to say hard work is bad, but hard work was part of the curse, wasn't it? By the sweat of your brow. Before, it wasn't the sweat of their brow. When they were just doing the work of the Lord, when they were just tending his garden, they could eat of whatever tree except for one, and it was after the sin that came in. So when we celebrate this Protestant work ethic, this valuing hard work, we are in a sense celebrating a part of the curse. And, it's certainly a part of human existence. There's no doubt about it. It was just throughout human history, people that don't work hard are few and far between, and maybe now in the current technology and everything, going forward, we're looking at, okay, there's not going to be enough hardworking jobs available for the people who are willing to do them because it's more efficient to have a machine do all those things. So now what? So it's not like we've solved the problem. We may have replaced a lot of, at least, the really hard manual labor jobs, but now what? So, or we're in the process, I should say, of maybe replacing them. But the God of Egypt, the fake God of Egypt, is the one saying, you're lazy, you got to work harder. It is the God of the Exodus. It is the God of creation who says, come into my rest. Leave your burdens behind, 3 days behind, and come into my rest. Or he's going to visit pestilence and sword upon them. So that's an interesting, worship me, cease from your labors, or I'll kill you. It's kind of, and we've seen he's already ready to kill Moses in the previous chapter. So it's a very important thing. It's a fundamental part of God's people that we trust in God to provide, and that we honor God for the provision we receive. I've known people not in our tradition, not in our faith background or whatever you want to call it, who frequently they'll go out and buy a car, sign up for a 6-year note or whatever, buy a car, and then thank God for giving them this car. And my reaction was always, well, God didn't give you that car. You just went and signed away 6 years of payments on that car to get that car. But that's one way of looking at it. My way is probably a cynical and earthly way of looking at it. Their ways, I think, probably a more spiritual way of looking at it. Yes, I got to make payments or whatever, but the Lord's going to give me the money to make those payments. And I've got this car. So who's giving me this car?
Well, I've been thinking of the New Testament example of the farmer that had an overabundance of crops, and he tore down his sheds and built more so he could keep it more. And then the Lord said, "Come with me."
Yeah, and that's a good story in this context. It's also the what did he say about his excess? You have enough for many years. You're well provided for. You. Not the Lord has blessed me abundantly. Let me be a fountain of blessings to others. Let me pour this out among my friends and neighbors, those who were not so blessed. No, it's I have been given this. So his attitude about the wealth is wrong from the get-go. And, this is kind of where I catch a lot of heat from a lot of different directions. When our congregations, when the churches of Christ were really strong, what was the top attendance, the era where this congregation was numerically its greatest? Probably the 60s, 70s. We need Mark here, but he's our historian. The era, whenever, the building predates that, and this is a pretty modest building. This is a building that we had 50 plus Sunday, and it felt pretty full. I mean, some of us grew up going to church where everybody sits hip to hip all the way, and you just fill up and squeeze in there wherever you can.
Well, in the early 90s here, we were putting extra seats back here, chairs. We were pretty full in the early 90s.
Okay, well, that area, well, when a congregation gets full, when they have a lot, when their building becomes fully occupied, the idea is usually, let's tear down this barn and build a bigger barn. And I preached at a congregation in the Seattle area many years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago. And they were embarrassed by their building because it was enormous. And they had 30 or 40, 50 people coming on Sunday morning. It probably would hold 500 or 600 people. And they were never quite that big, but they projected it as, let's tear down this, we're going to have all this coming in. And when we do that, as each individual congregation, when we do that, we can be expressing a confidence in the Lord to provide. We build it, they'll come, God will bring them to us. We can also be saying, we have to be careful, we have to judge. This is the spiritual practice of discernment. What's really going on here? What's our actual motivation? Are we tearing down a perfectly good barn to build a bigger barn because we think it's just always going to go like this?
And this is a perfectly good barn, so instead of tearing it down and building a bigger one, if you need to be, start another one over yonder or something.
There's that. And this isn't one of them, but there are congregations that seem to have more money than they know what to do with. And so they start trying to come up with ways of spending. What do we got to do with all this? And some pretty interesting ideas they come up with. And a lot of things are not bad ideas. I'm not saying I'm not commenting on any one specific thing. But they may well know of a congregation 20 miles away that maybe they have a decent number coming, but it's all poor people or something like that. And they need money constantly. They need to fix up the building. They need to help some poor people out in their congregation. And the idea of just giving some of that money, no strings attached, to another congregation is just, that's way down the list of what they're going to do with their money. So, but if you see that money as a gift from the Lord, God gave it to us. Maybe you think we don't spend it on bringing in the ice capades. We do something else. Nobody I know has ever brought in the ice capades, but we think about using it to help. Maybe send it to another part of the world, but also maybe send it to a different part of the county. Just want to say hello real quick to Roxy and Kim. We're glad you're tuning in here. That is an old school term, isn't it? You tuned in. You got that down just right. So this is what Pharaoh is doing. He's building bigger barns. He's not tearing down the old barns, but he's just kind of constantly building new and bigger barns, more and more barns. He's wealthy. He's powerful. He's always going to become more wealthy and more powerful, especially off the backs of the free labor of the Israelites. It's like when you have to hire a big crew to take care of your house, when you've got a 10,000 square foot house for, you, your spouse, and your 2.5 kids. And then you got to hire a gardener, and you got to hire a housekeeper, and you got to hire all these people to help with it because you have so much more than you need. And these are all cares of the world. These are all things that tie us to the world, that distract us. And then all of a sudden you got to ask, are my employees stealing from me? Do I have to have a couple of different safes put into the house? I got all these problems. And living a simpler life can be a way of walking away from some of this and walking towards God. And, I can say that now, Sherry and I never thought we would, but we have 2 houses that we're trying to cover and all that stuff right now we're hoping to get it to 1. We never plan on having 2, but we're hoping to get it to 1. Mm-hmm. And it's not a lot of fun to have to do all that. So even though it's a result of blessing, but at the same time, God has given it to us. But it is this idea that more and more things are a good thing. I mean, this is human materialism. This is this idea that my wealth and my power will get me what I want. I have more than I need because I went out and did it. Because in the sense of Pharaoh, probably because I was meant to be this way, because I was born to this. Because God wants me, even in kind of Christian nations that were to come, you had the divine right of kings. I don't know if you like to watch the guy Rick Steves, the travel guy that goes over to Europe. He's from the Seattle area, and he was in France. I watched him the other day. He was in France, and he went to Versailles, which was the palace built by Louis XIV, the greatest king of France. And it is absolutely enormous, and it was at the time far beyond any other standard of luxury that existed. You know, it was just unbelievable. And he was fully convinced that God meant him to be the great king, not really so much of France, but of Europe. And to him, Europe was the whole world. So he was supposed to be up there, and all these little peasants, God put them there to serve him. Now, Louis was a great king, and he was able to pull it off. A couple of descendants later, and it's, or I guess it was the guillotine, so it was like that. And heads rolled, so to speak. So it doesn't last. But it's just this contrast, and I think we have to kind of guard against it. Not on the level of Pharaoh, not that we're going to be on that level, but that we have some inclination towards that what we have isn't enough, that we need more, that we have a right to get it off of the labors of other people that aren't adequately compensated, that are not valued, but exploited. And, the answer to meeting our needs and making it through the world is always more and more labor, whether it's our labor or others' labor. There's always the constant need for more and more labor. And to that kind of human inclination, the God of the Exodus says, come into my rest, worship me. I will provide. And that's what God's people are supposed to believe, that God will provide. And it's kind of easy sitting here in a nice, toasty, warm auditorium in Walla Walla, Washington, while it's, probably 20 degrees outside, maybe colder than that. It's another thing to think that when you're huddled down maybe in a little house in Ukraine right now. And you see another Pharaoh with his great armies knocking on the door. And is your hope in a Pharaoh from across the ocean coming over there and delivering you? Now, God might use that other Pharaoh to come over. At the same time, God may allow you to go into servitude to that Pharaoh. God allowed the Hebrews to be in servitude to this Pharaoh for a long time. But God is on the side of the oppressed. God is on the side of people who call upon his name and rely and trust upon him over and above the Pharaohs, no matter how it looks to the rest of the world. No matter how you add, subtract, and multiply and divide all the different numbers, and God is ready to move, he's going to move, and nothing on earth will withstand him. And no Pharaoh can defeat him. So Pharaoh's message is to work harder. You're lazy, work harder. And the form of the increased labor is what?
You gotta go get your own material.
We're not going to give you straw to make your bricks.
Rick, on a personal note, once upon a time, there was a certain patriarch that I happen to know fairly well. And I'm pretty sure he didn't come up with the theory by reading this story. But his theory was that the best way to keep the children out of trouble is give them plenty of chores to do. If they started getting a little too wound up, you give them more chores and more work of some kind. And, it was a twofold kind of idea. You kept your children out of trouble, but the work they produced also benefited things that you wanted to have done for your personal benefit. It just struck me as very much like this, He's keeping the people out of trouble by giving them more work, but he's also gaining from that work. He continues to gain from their labor.
Yeah, there's a difference between employment and oppression and exploitation. And humans are and were created to serve a purpose. God gave Adam and Eve something to do in the garden. They weren't just there on vacation. They didn't have somebody bringing them fruity drinks as they sat by the rivers naked or anything like that. They were working, but it was a reasonable amount of work, and it was a work of service to the Lord. And there's plenty of Proverbs. You go through Proverbs is mostly very conventional wisdom. And let's face it, if you don't exercise some level of wisdom and some amount of industry, and you don't get after it a little bit, you're going to not make it through the hard times. You have to function, and you do have to be productive. But ultimately, you have to see that in context as even the ability to go work is a blessing from the Lord. The fact that you can work and be productive is a blessing from the Lord. And when you see someone who cannot be productive and who cannot go out and derive an income to support themselves, it is the calling upon those who are blessed to help that person, to not just amass more and more and more and more. Paul says, I don't remember, somebody can look it up if they want to, let the one who steals steal no more, but let him work, basically. Why? So that he may be a blessing to others. Not just so that he won't have to steal to live, but so that he can become a blessing. And I think that's, and I'm not trying to just pick on my parents or anybody. I think conventional American parental wisdom is that you want your kids to be hardworking and smart and educated and trained or whatever, so that they can be productive and take care of themselves, right? So they can buy a house maybe, so they can have a nice life. They can go on vacation every now and then, so they can give money to the church and all that to take care of themselves. So they can have the things they need and maybe some of the things they want. And I think we need to push the purpose past that a little bit towards Paul's message, which is so that you can be a blessing to others. When we look around and we maybe don't like government overreach into our personal lives, when we don't like government programs that we have to pay for with our tax money, and we see all the inefficiencies perhaps rather than the good that comes out of them, and I want to say for the sake of this discussion, they do accomplish good. You may debate that. When employers bemoan labor unions, when we don't like all of the mechanisms, the earthly mechanisms that have arisen to kind of force people with to behave a certain way towards people without. Well, if the people with had acted consistently with the commandments of God from the get-go, those mechanisms would have never arisen. The law of Moses says you're supposed to pay your workers daily and a fair wage. You don't withhold it from them. He's counting on that. Just think if all those big industrialists that build those huge mansions and all that, just think if they had paid their workers in the 1890s and 1910s, if they just paid them a fair wage then, where would we be now? I may have used this example before. If you're ever up in Victoria, I don't know how you feel about Canada right now, but if you ever go back up to Victoria, BC, you can go to the Craig Derrick Castle, I think is what it's called, and it was built by a coal mining baron in that area. And it's big, beautiful. It needs, at least it's been 15 years or more since I was there. It needed some renovation at the time, and they were processing it a little bit at a time. But the value of it is beyond estimation because it used materials, woods especially, from endangered trees and things like that, maybe even extinct trees now. Just off the charts opulent at the time. Meanwhile, the guys working in his coal mine could not afford to buy enough coal to keep their house warm in the winter. There's always another Pharaoh. There's always someone else trying to build up their empire off the sweat and toil and unfairly compensated labors of others. And then they'll gripe when the government steps in or a labor union comes up or whatever. If they had treated them right, they treated them biblically from the get-go, they could have avoided all of that. If they didn't feel like they had to have, the banister on my staircase must be of a wood that only grows on one tree in the middle of Africa, and I want to kill that one. It's the only tree left, and I want to kill it to make the banister of my staircase. If you don't have to have all this opulence, if you don't have to have all of these things when you're in a position of power, you can be more like our master, who didn't amass wealth, who would look at what Elon Musk or Bill Gates or any of these other billionaires we have today and laugh at what they have. Their wealth is a pittance. To him, what he gave up, they're just like us. They're just like the poorest members of our congregation. They're like the people that are laying around on the streets in Walla Walla at night because they don't have anything. That's how they look to Jesus, considering the wealth he left behind. Pharaoh is just as poor and needy as anyone. He just doesn't know it. What he has blinded him to that. Who is the Lord that I should obey? You're about to find out who he is. Okay.
That is Ephesians 4:28, by the way.
Okay.
He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with his own hands, that he may have something to share with those in need.
So it goes beyond, and it's not that what we are teaching is wrong, but it stops short of really the biblical. There's always another level to go. That's the thing. Until you do what Jesus did, which is to literally lay down your life in an agonizing way, praying for the people who are killing you while they're killing you. Until you do that, You haven't gotten there yet. You haven't done what he did yet. So we've all got a lot of room to grow. I'm glad you're here, Kim and Roxy and Robin and Sherry and whoever else is lurking out there anonymously. We're thankful for everyone. And we're going to pick back up with No Straw for the Bricks next week. And it will be at 11 o'clock in the morning. So we will lose Sherry watching it live anyway. So maybe we'll pick up some folks either on live or on the internet or here in person, hopefully. So that's next week. We'll be live streaming at 11 o'clock. So a little bit afterwards. Thank you for your attendance. And Brother Kelsey.